So, Matt, I need to tell you about, aside from the tattoos, the only time I ever got a body modification.
Okay, is this going to be your story?
No, and I'm going to have to bleep that out. No, it was the time when I went, the only body modification I've ever gotten, aside from that, which no one will actually know what you said, I went to get my earlobe pierced and nearly cried from the pain.
Did you?
Yeah, you know, I can stick tattoos, but just like, you know, those weird fleshy bits, nah, not for me. I am on the fence. I really want to get my nose pierced, but I just need to like take the jump and do it. See, the thing is that I don't want to get a stud because I don't want to have to go through the process of trying to heal it. So I'm trying to figure out, I was like, can they just put a loop in? Will they put a loop in? Is it just going to like make my nose go septic and my nose is going to swell and get even bigger than it already is? So, you know,
all the cool kids have septic nose piercings, Tom.
Yeah. All the cool kids have big jeans, mid parts, and septic nose piercings. But if you want to support me getting a nose piercing, make sure to check out the Patreon, where you can hear bonus episodes and episodes like this early before anyone else.
Will the Patreon patrons hear what I asked you that you've just beeped out?
No, no one needs to know that. But yeah, we have like a really, really interesting topic today because
I want to focus with our guests, who we'll introduce in a second, on a tattoo themed topic. But we'll definitely, I'm sure, at the introduction, stray into some wider stuff, and then we'll have him back to talk more about all the amazing things that he does. This is the man, by the way. Before I give him his full introduction,
the myth, the legend.
Yeah, this is the man, Tom, who is in my opinion single-handedly responsible for the modern fashion for for navel piercings.
The man, the myth, the legend, the queen of this podcast and the queen of the world, Mr. Paul King.
Have you ever seen, Tom, the Aerosmith video for Crying?
Yeah,
Alicia Silverstone. That's Paul in that video.
Oh wow! I am in the presence of celebrity. I thought you were famous, Matt. Paul, has anyone ever tried to steal your identity?
Actually, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're now like what, up to 3 people who featured on this show, including you, Matt, who's had their identity like impersonated.
Yeah.
So this is my friend, the legend, mentor, genius, Paul King, who is treasurer at the Association of Professional Piercers. He is the head honcho at the Body Piercing Archive. He is an amazing body piercer in his own right, and has been involved with like jewelry manufacture for a very long time. He's published books, including an amazing book on Mr. Sebastian recently. He's created exhibitions on piercing and body modern tattoo history, and is just an all-round like just excellent human being. So yeah, it's really nice to have you on the podcast, Paul.
Matt, can I just take you everywhere with me, and you can be like the talent provider?
I'll be your hype man.
Just it's like those, you know, the monkey in the box. You wind it up and it pops out and starts clapping cymbals. Also, I should probably introduce the show as well. You're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your hosts, Thomas Amani, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. Anyway, hello. I always forget to do it and then have to do it like 5 minutes in. So, Paul, you're very welcome to the show. This is I can already tell this is going to be extremely chaotic and a pain in the ass to edit, but we roll anyway.
It's always a shit show when Matt and I get together.
Last time I saw you, Paul, I was pretending to be you with at short notice.
Triggered. I'm triggered. You saved my ass. Our conference, the Association of Professional Piercers conference last year, of which I'm one of the organizers, and Matt was our esteemed special guest that came over to give a talk. Ended up having to carry the entire show because I got COVID, could not do any of the docent tours for the exhibit, could not even teach my own class. So Matt jumped in with a PowerPoint he'd never seen before, just faked it. He did a brilliant job.
And it turned out that I was also probably positive with COVID because I tested positive when I was home. I was negative on the day, but I was also sick. I did a jazz freestyle improvisation of Paul King.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But did I miss anything in the introduction, Paul? Is there anything that you want to tell our audience about yourself?
No, that was plenty of adjectives. Thank you.
So as Tom said, I think there's a million things we could talk about, and I do want to talk to you about piercing more specifically, but really what I wanted to get you on today to talk about, to narrow it down, because if we're not careful, we talk for hours. Do you remember, Tom, for example, I was at an event in Germany, and I saw Paul, and I literally bumped into him. We started chatting, and we didn't move for about 4 hours. We just sat.
That sounds about right. That's it. From my experience socializing with Matt, that sounds just about right.
Yeah. But for sort of narrow purposes, and I know it's uppermost in your mind at the moment, and it's uppermost in my mind too, is the story of Rudi Inhelder, who is this figure who sort of bestrides tattooing and piercing histories, is such a really interesting and I think you're discovering, Paul, even more important figure than we realized. So do you want to tell us about Rudi and what you're doing? And
I'll tell you what I know. That's what I can do so far. I can tell you what I know. Rudi Inhelder was born in Switzerland. He appears to come from at least a middle-class upbringing. He was very well educated. Became a physicist and did things with lighting. He always had both technical and high-end jobs. That would mean that he would fly. He lived for a time in New York City, and then he would live in Munich. So and then in London. So we had.
And he was born late 1930s, was he? Early 1940s.
1929.
Yeah.
He was born in 1929. So I think for what it's worth, I'm not going to give you a linear layout. I'd rather talk a little bit about how I discovered him and then how he unfolds. So I had known about Rudi Inhelder. I was trained and I used to work for a company called Gauntlet. They were the first piercing shop in the Western world. And Rudi Inhelder was a sometime contributor to a magazine that Gauntlet put out called PFIQ. And so I had this vague knowledge of his name, and also there's some fairly within nerdy circles of piercing and tattooing, there's some iconic images of Rudi Inhelder with Elizabeth Weinzierl, who's considered like the grandmother of tattooing enthusiasts, and Mr. Sebastian and Jim Ward in 1978 on a trip that Jim Ward and Doug Malloy and Sailor Sid made, to Europe to go to the second tattoo convention there in Amsterdam. But also to meet Mr. Sebastian and Tattoo Sammy. So it was really important. Lots of name dropping because that's what kind of trip it was an extremely important, well-connected trip. So Rudi Inhelder's in pictures there. And whenever Jim Ward would talk about this trip, his name would come up. It turns out that was the one and only time that Jim Ward and Rudi Inhelder actually ever met in person. They had very little contact. So, but Rudi's name would pop up. Like if you're nerdy at all and you're reading any of the old newsletters and magazines that are put out by the tattoo associations, Rudi's name would pop up. But the thing is, he was not a tattoo artist. He was just a diehard enthusiast, but a man of means and a polyglot and very well connected. So are we doing all right? Do you have any questions so far?
Yeah, well, I should probably say like my intro story to him, which was as with many of my tattoo history stories, like via Lal Hardy, who
someone ring the Lal Hardy bell. Knock it off on your bingo card.
There should be. That man is epic. Yes, there should be a Lal Hardy bell.
So when I was I started to get tattooed at Lal's studio in like 2003, and very shortly, after then, in the sort of, going in there every, few months at the time to get tattooed by Martin Clark, who worked there at the time, like Rudi's name would come up, or this guy called Rudi Inhelder, and I knew about him really only as this kind of collector, this guy who'd been around tattooing for a very long time, and he'd been tattooed by a lot of very famous tattoo artists. And he was known around the UK scene as this kind of, this collector, really, a guy who would have had a great collection of material because he'd sort of been around the scene for so long. And at the time, I didn't know much more than that, but he, as Paul was saying, like, he's one of these names that the more you get into tattoo history, and particularly if you're looking at the connections, and really such as we'll go into, I'm sure, that's an interesting figure, because he is one of these connection points between European, British, and American tattooing. The more you sort of stumble across his name, and certainly if you've seen photographs of the tattoo scene from the 70s in particular and 80s, you will have seen pictures of Rudi even if you didn't know it was him, because he's got some iconic tattoos on him by some really famous artists. So that was kind of my introduction to him as well, Paul. Like I didn't know. I mean, again, I also knew that he was a gay man. So Lau told me that, and that he had a boyfriend, and he lived in Switzerland, and that was basically what I knew about him. Until you and I were talking in a lot more detail about what we both knew when we started chatting last year. But yeah, I think so. That is a good indication ever. Is like, both you and I. You're a bit older than me, Paul. Sorry to say that. But yeah. But both of us with our kind of nerderies encountered Rudi as this present but peripheral figure, right? Because he's not, as you said, he's not a tattoo artist. He's a guy that gets tattooed. For once,
Matt gets to call someone old, and it's not me calling him old.
So he was identified, like, in Jim Ward was the founder of the Gauntlet, and in Jim Ward's worldview, Inhelder was an early enthusiast in piercing and tattooing. So that puts him in this special circle of gay men that were heavily pierced, heavily tattooed from at least the 70s. But keep in mind, that's, when Jim really enters into the piercing world. And while for many of us, like, oh, wow, 1970s is so long ago, it's like, we got to wind that clock back. We got to step back further, because that's Inhelder predates Jim Ward's exposure or entry into the world of piercing. So do you want to hear a little bit more about Inhelder?
Yeah. Keep this. I think
so. Everyone has, So everyone kind of, has their origin story. And for Rudi, he would tell a few times in interviews that he first read the book Pierced Hearts and True Love in 1954. This book was published by or written by Hans Ebenstein. Forgive me if I mispronounce the last name. And Hans had written the book in 1953. So this, like, soon after, it's kind of an iconic book for tattoo nerds out there. What a lot of people don't know is Hans was also a gay man. And Hans went on to, all of these people have their own stories. It's wild. Hans went on to start the first gay travel group for men in the 70s, and he pierced other books, but this was the only tattoo book he ever published. And it was just because he had an interest in it.
He said he didn't like tattoos. I've just gone and pulled my coffee off the shelf. In literally the introduction, there's a quote in here where he says, "I don't really like tattoos, but I was sort of interested in them."
It's so wild and Matt, jump in when you want to, when you find the quote. It's so wild that, Hans, not really having an interest in tattooing, writes this book, and that Rudi Inhelder, having this special quality that I've identified in a lot of the pioneers, where they don't just have an interest, they have an interest and they have motivation and they take action and they figure it out. So Inhelder writes to Hans and it's like, this tattooing, this is incredible. I want to know more about tattooing, and I'm sure a very Swiss way. And Hans is like, well, you should talk to the English. You should maybe talk to this guy, Rich Mingens. And Hans introduces by, correspondence, Inhelder to Rich Mingens. And the following year, in 1955, Inhelder goes over to what was basically the first London tattoo convention.
Yeah. And so, Mingens is cited in the book as the technical consultant. This is the quote. Hans Ebertson is not himself a tattoo fan. Despite the thoroughness of his researches, he's remained untattooed except for a small emblem on his arm just to see whether it would hurt or not. It didn't. So that 1955 London Tattoo Club is where, again, Tom will have seen those photos when we went to Cardiff to see the Jesse collection. The photos of Jesse with Rich Mingens and Al Shafley from Sandusky, Ohio, and Les Scoos and Cash Cooper. That is that 1955 London Tattoo Club meeting. It's where Jesse came runner-up as champion tattooer of all England. And maybe it's worth, we'll probably have to do a whole episode on the London Tattoo Club at some point, but just as an aside, that's a group of people who are basically an offshoot of the Bristol Tattoo Club. So Les Scoos had started the Bristol Club a few years earlier. He was this great kind of networker, and his contacts in London through Rich Mingens and Rich Mingens' brother Alf in particular, with Cash, another guy called Zeke Owens as well, became a bit of a nexus of organising of tattooing in London. And they wouldn't call them conventions, but they just sort of met up in pubs and had tattoo competitions and drank pints of bitter. Lots of men, but there were some women around as well. And
imagine how those pubs smelled at that time. Carpet that had probably about 100 years of ale spilled on it.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally.
This is the thing that I always talk about with people when they talk about it'd be so cool to live in this decade or that decade. And I was like, you realize how bad everything smelled? It's every single room smelled like plastic upholstery and cigarettes. And I smoke, and I would find that disgusting.
Yeah. So Inhelder, in 1 year, he reads this book, he writes to the author, he gets correspondence introduction, and he's in London for this get together, and he's meeting the creme de la creme of European, at least UK, and some American tattoo artists. He's immediately in the middle of it, and having that scientific type of mind that he does, he's documenting all of it. He's photographing all of it. It's just incredible once you start really breaking it down. And one of the things that he walks away from, and I'm going to take a little liberty here because he's not around for me to ask him, is I think he felt that sense of community that you can in the tattoo world that was really coming together at this time. And he loved it. It was passionate for him, having the camaraderie and the common interests and the art form. And let's be honest, he was a gay man. So there was also some sexuality mixed in there as well. So it really had the whole thing for him.
Yeah, and I was going to say as well, particularly I suppose at that time, queerness wasn't an overly visible thing, and having a sense of belonging to whatever community that would accept you and understand that here is a load of people who live a little bit differently than everyone else, and it's kind of regardless of how brash some of the people would have been, that they were welcoming to people who were different and maybe a little bit misunderstood.
I think it's also a story that probably a lot of people listening, and certainly I can resonate with, right? Because he was 25, he didn't have any tattoos at the time, but he read this book and was like, oh, holy shit, that's what I want to do and get into. And he
just like me for real.
Yeah, well, for myself, when I was like, I was probably 10 years younger than, or 15 years younger than he was at the time. I was probably like 12 or 13, but I was also then seeing magazines and getting on the early internet when I was about 15. And the same thing of like, oh my God, like these are my people. And I think like that's a very, it's a very kind of understandable thing for lots of people in this community, I think,
Yeah. And, talking a little bit to the queer or gay perspective, it's fascinating. Like, the tattoo community has many reputations. One of them is not being very accepting of homosexuality, especially at this time period. But that's certainly not entirely true. There was a lot of, I don't want to say even don't ask, don't tell. There was a lot of, we don't need to necessarily talk about this. Everyone knows what's up, and sort of like a passive acceptance. For sure, people knew that he was gay. It wasn't an issue. He was accepted on the merit of his knowledge and his enthusiasm and his respect, mutual respect.
A very good metaphor that someone once told me is, it's called being in the closet, but there's no doors on the wardrobe.
Yeah. I can get on board with that. So in 1957, work takes Rudi to New York. And he gets to New York, and you had already mentioned Al Shefley. And although Al had tried to, he had brought together some tattoo artists for what's considered like the first get together. But there wasn't an organization, and Rudi really missed that. He missed this, like the Bristol Tattoo Club. He missed these organizations that were starting to form, and and this is the unfortunate part. I don't know who his friends were. For sure, one of them was Paul McNaughton, because he's like the president of this newfound club. For sure, Paul was one, but I don't know who the other friends were. But he and some friends decided, well, let's reproduce this. Let's start a club over here in the U.S. And they were having these conversations in 1963. And then in January of 1964, they launched the Tattoo Club of America. Now, on paper, it was, a club that lasted 2 years, 1964 to 1966. When you look at what little correspondence is available, everyone's hating on Rudi. He's a total flake. He's terrible at correspondence. The newsletters are always late. People are getting pissed off and questioning if they should continue their membership. So there's a lot of unhappiness within the group, just as far as organizational
just
issues.
Sounds like my WhatsApps with Matt. Not right, Matt?
Totally.
How dare you? How dare you?
Yeah. So it's only around for 2 years. I know of 9 known issues of the newsletter. I believe that there are up to 13. Here's the big problem. If anyone out there has those issues, even the Tattoo Archive doesn't have a complete set of the newsletters. Like, they are scarce. So if you've got them, please come forward. Let Matt know. We just need digital copies. It's just crucial we get that information, because even though it was a very short-lived organization, it had tremendous ripples as far as connections. This organization for me was all about the connections.
Yeah. And it's amazing, like, so Paul included an early membership list in the exhibition that he did in Vegas, and I hadn't seen that before until Paul showed it to me. And like, I'll give you some names, Tom, from that early list.
Hit me with them.
So the first name on the list is Ron Ackers, right? Who we also talked about in a couple of weeks when we interviewed Julia about how he was also, one of the first foreign tattooists to work in Spain, and he was also
famous van owner Ron Ackers.
Famous van owner, really, really interesting early correspondent of Ed Hardy's. So Ron Ackers is in there. We have also got Eddie Funk. We have got Cindy Ray. We have got God, I'm just reading the list here. It's just Jeff Baker, Rich Mingins, like just her, all of these people that go on to be, completely key figures. Albrecht Brecker, who's a really important German tattooer. All of these really, really important and interesting people.
To correct that, although Albrecht Becker did tattoos, he's very important historically as an artist and piercing and tattooing pioneer, but he was not a professional tattoo artist.
Thank you. That's a good point. Thank you for that clarification. He published some books, didn't he?
Yeah. But so here's to really nerd out. So you're looking at a directory, which when you start to dive into the newsletters, there's inference that this is not the first. And there's also inference that there was another one that was going to be coming after this. So like I said, there's big holes in the information that we have. And if you start to read through the newsletters, then you can add to that directory names like Phil Sparrow, Lone Wolf, Les Scoose, Al Sheffley, Paul Rogers, Huck Spalding. It's literally almost everyone that was anyone was joining this club. Cliff Raven, Doc Forbes,
Diesel. And Rudy's got photos with all of them.
So one of the things that makes this so spectacularly interesting was the structure. And this is where I really nerd out. So Rudi had a questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, he asks what could be on the surface a lot of mundane questions like, do you like tattoos? Obviously you do. How many tattoos do you have? Where are these tattoos? Are you interested in exchanging correspondence? Are you interested in buying photographs? Are you interested in meeting other people? By the way, do you like images of tattooed women? Yes or no? And then at the very, very bottom was, do you have piercings? Yes or no? That was the last, you could almost miss it. It's literally at the very bottom. The thing is, when you start to take these questions and look at them schematically, if I have someone that's super into tattooing, but is identifying as not married and isn't into images of tattooed women, you can start to infer that this person might have same-sex attraction, especially as you start corresponding. So it was and this is how you had to navigate. Keep in mind, in many places, homosexuality was illegal at this time. So Paul McNaughton, who's the president of the Tattoo Club of America, and another enthusiast, and Rudi Inhelder were both gay men. So they were trying to navigate, how do we do both? How do we meet other gay men that have interests and promote tattoo history, tattoo culture?
And it's really, really mad, right, to think that the tattoo world was so, and we'll get to the schisms that come after this bit in a minute, but it's really interesting to realize that at this time, right, I mean, other members, again, people that we've mentioned on the podcast, right, Sailor Jerry was a member, Bert Grimm was a member, Pinky Yun was a member, Lyle Tuttle was a member, all these people that, some of them who, Lyle and Sailor Jerry, we talked about with Danielle, didn't like each other, but they're in the same club together. And you've got this club which encompasses, the conservative old school artists like Sailor Jerry. You've got kind of well-respected figures globally like Rich Mingins and Les Scoose. And then you've got a group of customers and artists who were a bit weirder and a bit stranger and a bit queerer in lots of ways. And I think it's so interesting to me, again, Paul and I spent a lot of time talking about this when we were in Vegas together, how this period of tattoo history, right, coming out of what I called in my own exhibition, the dark days for tattooing, the post-war period, where Les Scoose in particular in England is advocating for tattooing in a way that, is trying to keep it alive in the face of a lot of public opprobrium. And, the first time the phrase tattoo renaissance gets coined is not about Ed Hardy in the 70s, but it's about Les Scoose in the 50s. But at that time, when the industry is fragile and the people that are into it are like into it. They're really into it. That group is small enough to encompass the conservative and the radical, the queer and the straight, the out and the closeted, the underground and the mainstream, as far as that term might apply. And I think that, to me, is this group of people which pivots around Rudi, is such a fascinating illustration of what's happening in tattooing. Because you've got basically Europe, America, Britain, a little bit of Australia. You've got some of those artists like Pinky who are, from Hong Kong, but connected to the European scenes. And that's it, right? That's what you've got going on.
So I'm going to take a guess here, and this is a guess, that at its height, there were probably about 300 members. And I'm doing that based on looking at the numbering system and how that numbering system changed, by the way, in 1966, right before the club died. They restructured all the numbering system, which, if you're doing investigation, keep that in mind when you come across club. They changed. I've been able to identify
the highest number on this list is Bert Grimm at 300, who's member 300.
Right, and then the nomenclature shifts to where the number would identify, were you American, not American, an enthusiast, or a professional tattoo artist. So like in 66, they changed all that. So just by looking at the number, you could identify someone. So I'm guessing again, about 300 members, I've been able to identify 138. Now, of those 138, 74 were professional tattooers. That's only 54%. The other 64, which is 46%, were enthusiasts or amateur tattoo artists. So you really just have this mixture. And get this is what was shocking to me. Like, Matt saw this walking through the exhibit that we did. Like, I had some red circles around people that were identified as piercing pioneers. And I want to say at that time, there might have been 10. I'm up to 35 people that have been identified as piercing pioneers out of that 138. That's a hefty percentage. Hefty.
Nobody tell Glenn Danzig.
Yeah, totally. So, the way that, so I had this brief introduction to Rudi Inhelder, but it was after Fakir Mushafar passed away.
Member 97?
Yes, which is a very low number, which means he was a very early member. After Roland, and he was going by Roland Loomis. It wasn't until the late 70s that Fakir Mushafar became his dominant name. But when Roland died in 2018, I was already working with him actually before he died and starting to go through his collection, which then continues to this day. And I started coming across these correspondences. And you can break down Fakir Mushafar's correspondences, really, personal stuff. A few things in the late 50s when he was doing a corset company, but then it's the 60s. All of a sudden, like, wow, you're like meeting people all over the world that are into piercing. And I hadn't made the connection yet. And it turns out, again, if I was going to do a rough percentage of these early correspondence, it turned out that probably 90% of them were through the Tattoo Club of America. And I started reading references to TCA numbers, to, the Tattoo Club, and it just like, what is going on here? And so then I found within Fakir's papers, I found some issues, the Tattoo Club of America, and of course, all roads lead back to Rudi Inhelder. And so what he would do with that questionnaire, one of the things in the questionnaire that's really great is it's like, give me 3 friends that might be interested in this, and tell me your 3 favorite tattoo artists. And then he would use those addresses to further spread the questionnaires and to recruit members. But everything went back to Rudi. everything. So like anytime someone filled something out, it would go back to Rudi. And Rudi was requesting photographs, and he would have all these letters. So anyone that is a member, all those names that we just mentioned, without exception, would have corresponded with Rudi at least once. And as I'm starting to figure this out, I'm like, and then also, of course, reading articles where he's talking about his archive, I'm like screaming at Matt. I'm like, Matt, we have to find this archive.
Okay, we'll save that story for the end of the podcast, shall we?
Okay, yeah, you got it.
But maybe this is like a little bit of a dumb question, but for someone who's like more familiar with tattooing than piercing, like obviously we see like a whole like range of every type of piercing you can probably get. Every week I see like a new type of piercing on TikTok, and I'm like, oh, that seems cool. I won't get part of my ear cut out to get like things put there, but like what were people getting at this time? Obviously Rudi probably has like evidence of everything. It's not just Prince Albert's and septum piercings.
Well, it's funny that you say it's not just like, it's not just, I mean, people aren't just getting face tattoos and hand tattoos.
Yeah.
Once again, the listeners will accuse me of being reductive, but it's for the sake of you. It's for the sake of simplicity.
Let's try to... It's really hard when we're looking at history to put ourselves in another place in time. So I'm going to try and do this. One of the things that I research is a publication called London Life. And, I'll be reading letters from correspondents in there. And you'll have someone that... today, we would identify as transgender. They had different terms then, but we'll stick to the transgender. You'll have someone that is expressing like, there is nothing that I would love more than to be able to, wear, my dresses in public. I can do it sometimes. I want to do it more. But what I would really love, what I'm really missing, that would really just complete me, would be if I could have pierced ears. There's nothing I would love, but I can't do that. So I guess I'll pierce my nipples.
Yeah, and this is in the 50s, Tom, and even earlier actually, 30s, 40s, 50s. Yeah. So
like something like a Prince Albert, or like what you don't understand yet, and hopefully I'll get you there, is a man, someone identified or assigned male at birth, having their ears pierced was a revolutionary act that could get you killed. Even in the 80s, having both my ears pierced, I would have beer bottles thrown at me. So, like...
You sure that was because of your piercings, Paul?
Maybe the blue hair.
It wasn't your bad attitude.
Oh my God! Yeah, I did have a bad
Sorry, I shouldn't make a joke about historical homophobia, but
no. It was definitely people talking. There were certain words that would be hurled at me when they would see the ears pierced. It was definitely associated with that. I really want to underscore the power of, it's not, it might be more easier for someone in the audience to understand, like, if you're of a certain age, like a neck or a hand tattoo. Oh my God, that was revolutionary. That was wild. That was like a job stopper. Like, I hope you're prepared to be homeless. Like you wouldn't be able to get an apartment. Like it would so interfere with your life once upon a time. And it was the same just for an earlobe piercing. So when somebody has a septum or ear cartilage or nipple, or like, this was just science fiction to try and wrap your head around.
I mean, science fiction's the right way to put it, because Paul, and to a lesser extent me, spend a lot of time looking for evidence of early piercing. And a lot of what we're finding is basically people imagining the kind of piercings they'd like to get if it were possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, again, maybe some in the audience can relate back to in the very early 90s, and for a few in the late 80s, if you had stretched ears, people would stop you in a grocery store and have to process this with you. Like, is that a hole? Does that really go all the way through? So like, and we just, it's what we call our matter of facts now. It's just a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. So I know I've kind of beleaguered the point, but I really want to stress, like, oh, no. If you had a piercing, then that was a very big deal. Even an earlobe was a very big deal.
A lot of just as a we're already 42 minutes into the recording. This is what happened in Vegas. We were me and Paul were supposed to be doing back-to-back hour-long talks each, and we did a joint one that was about 4 hours long.
Yeah.
Part two. The crowd want part two.
Well,
Sure.
so what's interesting again about this period in terms of tattooing, and we can talk about Rich Mingens again here, and Mr. Sebastian too, but lots of these photos that we have, some of which would have been traded through the Tattoo Club of America, some of which were traded through the Bristol Tattoo Club, particularly by Les Scous's brother Bill, who was a tattooer in Aldershot. There was this kind of network, trading of photography. The famous one also in the US was Bernard Coble. And a lot of these guys in these tattoo photos happen to have nipple piercings. And again, Paul and I spent a lot of time talking about this. What's super interesting about that is that no one ever mentions it or talks about it or says who does them or where they got them done.
Nope.
And we've, Paul and I have, and Paul more than me have started to backfill some of that information. But what was kind of amazing is how it was there in that scene, but it wasn't really talked about, even though, as Paul was saying, it's freaking wild. And there are, again, we should do a whole separate episode about the history of piercing, but it's interesting that, bring it back to Rudi, that he was able to find these people that even had more stuff going on than maybe even the people who were involved in the scene realized, right? This moment in the 50s is nascent for the tattoo industry, but it's also really nascent for the body piercing industry in a way that I think the people involved didn't even have the language to realize at the time.
I think you're touching on something really interesting there. You use the word tattoo industry and then you paralleled it with, nascent for the piercing industry. There was no piercing industry.
Exactly.
And I think that's why it wasn't talked about. So there was no profession of professional piercer. It wasn't until really the 50s, 60s that occasionally you would find a tattoo artist, and more so in Europe, that would offer ear piercing services, really from the 60s, 70s. But there wasn't an identity, and therefore there wasn't an industry, and therefore, again, much less talking about these things. And we're able to cull the information just by going through the correspondence. And, someone writes a letter in the 60s going, Paul McNaughton passed through Germany, met with Hoffman, and Hoffman pierced his nipples. And it's just like a throwaway sentence. Hoffman never identified as a body piercer, but we have in writing and a diagram of what the instrument looked like and a description of gold rings being inserted into nipples. That's a body piercer, folks.
Every time Paul and I find it, and these are very rare and sparse, but every time we come across them, we send each other WhatsApps going, look, we found another one. Oh my God.
Totally. Yeah, totally. So keep in mind, all roads lead back to Rudi Inhelder. He's getting all this correspondence. He's saving all the photographs that he's asked people to send him. He's got the letters, and he then turns around and he starts playing matchmaker. Now, for sure, some of the people that were early members were people that he had already found through the gay circles. He already found these people, a few with common interests, but he's able to exponentially grow those circles and start introducing people to each other.
Well, bear in mind, this is New York in the run up to Stonewall, right? So this is also the historical context of an increasingly visible, increasingly kind of confident in many ways movement of gay men and trans women. Largely, there were some butch lesbians around on the scene as well, but that moment in New York's really pivotal for gay history for a reason. And again, sort of by luck of history, Rudi's in the middle of it. And I don't think, I certainly don't know, maybe Paul does, if there's any links between Rudi and the TCA to more visible kind of Stonewall era gay rights movements. I haven't come across any.
No,
but it's certainly
this was still very underground.
Yeah, but it's certainly something in the air in New York at the time for queer organizing and for kind of subcultural organizing as well, right? Don't forget, it's the period of Andy Warhol's Factory and of Basquiat and of the anti-Vietnam War protests and the aftermath of the Korean War, and it's this interesting moment in American and global history where youth subculture and countercultures of various kinds are coming together and disagreeing and fomenting disputes and being very creative. It's a really interesting time and place for him to be part of.
I think some of this, and forgive me, but this is what we do. I think some of this is right before that. It's right before the
exactly.
It's right before that tipping point. Into the chaos of the late 60s and early 70s. So Rudy's playing matchmaker, and he's like, hey, Roland Loomis, I think you should talk to this guy, Albert Becker, over in Germany. There is no way that they would have ever come in contact with each other. But Rudy is able to implement these. And then what then happens is these people, they start to feel each other out. And you can see it in the correspondence. I don't want to offend you, but would you like to see some photos of my heavily tattooed penis? And so that might be the next, and then before you know it, they're talking about same-sex encounters, but it's all done really courteous, and it's done in this methodical way of, I don't know, there's a real polite social etiquette when you read these letters.
It's quite matter of fact as well, because again, a lot of them talk about technique. A lot of the letters have sketches in them of how things are done, because there's no internet or even magazine culture really. So these guys, and it is all guys, really. I mean, there's a couple of women, a few women in the club, but they're a lot of them are the kind of club joining type as well, right? Sort of this kind of, I often think that, and I'm really lucky. I found a photo of Rudy with Phil Sparrow, with Samuel Stewart, because I think they're similar kind of guys where they're collecting and they're networking, but it's also information sharing. It's also kind of being really interested, researching stuff, because they've got that kind of academic kind of mind.
And as well, I was going to say, this sort of stuff is super important for history, because without people, sharing these letters and sending each other pictures, we wouldn't know that this stuff exists right now, because no one would have seen it, and no one would have kept it in a little lockbox in, a chest of drawers.
Well, the thing is, they did when they were live. These things were precious.
Mm-hmm.
They were so valued, and they would be kept for decades. The problem always was, I don't think I've seen a story yet. I'm sure they exist, but I haven't seen a story yet where, oh yeah, I got tired of everything, and so I threw it away. It's always, and then they died, and they hadn't made plans for it. And the family gets their hands on it and freaks out, gets rid of it, burns it, destroys it over and over and over again, particularly with the piercing history. Over and over and over again, it gets destroyed. But what Matt touched on is absolutely true. What we see in the 60s, and I'm doing a chapter for Oxford University Press right now on this, is showing that the 1970s even did not just happen. We think of the gauntlet as being the starting point for piercing. I'm like, no, folks. They were working out how do we enlarge piercings, better techniques for piercing. All of that stuff was getting worked on in the 60s between and showing direct connection to then what would happen in the 70s.
Yeah.
Rudi Inhelder.
Yeah. And I think the other thing about Rudi, and this is again, I think, true of a lot of people that I spend a lot of time with. So it's also interesting to see who Rudi meets and makes friends with. So as I said, he was tattooed by Phil Sparrow, Samuel Stewart. He was also tattooed a lot by George Bone, who we should also get on the show. George Bone's still working as a tattooer. He's in his 80s. He started tattooing out of his dad's like spare bedroom in the 1960s. Like literally, people used to turn up, and his mum would send them up to his room so he could tattoo them.
Amazing.
He was Britain's most tattooed man for a long time. He got tattooed and he did tattoo Mr. Sebastian. But the thing about George is he could retire. He doesn't need to be getting out of bed and tattooing 3 days a week, but he loves it. He's obsessed with tattooing, And
I really want to meet him, Matt. I need to meet Mr. Bone.
He's such a good guy. And when you speak to George, that becomes really clear. And these people, like Lau, like George, like Alex Binney, and I think Rudi comes in this thing. Like there are people, these people just love it so much. And Rudi, he's around tattooing, even though he's not a tattooer, for his whole life. So he passes away, in 2003. Yeah. So just about the time that I sort of became aware of him. But he was still running, contacts and correspondence groups. He was members of piercing associations. He was also a skinhead, and so he's also this interesting crossover between kind of the tattoo scene and the skinhead movement in lots of ways. But he's clearly this guy that just loves tattooing.
So Matt, can you clarify, because there should be a distinction. There are what we recognize as skinhead, just like is what we recognize as bikers, and then there's the oftentimes gay appropriation, if you will, of that aesthetic. So was he a skinhead, or was he a gay man into the skinhead aesthetic?
Well, I sort of touch upon this a little bit in the book, right, where I'm talking about what's happening with Mr. Sebastian in the 80s. I think the standard distinction in certainly with fashion history and social history has been to distinguish those two groups of people quite clearly. I think the crossover's a lot messier from both directions. So you have guys like Nicky Crane, who's the most obvious example, right? Like lead organizer for the National Front, on the cover of Screwdriver albums, really nasty, horrible bastard, but also gay, appeared in gay porn and bounced in his spare time for gay clubs. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people like Rudi, who was part of the skinhead scene, who loved skinhead bands. I think he ran a skinhead fanzine, or certainly wrote.
I did not know that.
Well, I think I've certainly found correspondence, at least one letter from him in a skinhead magazine, but who also were gay. And there was a club in London for gay skinheads that attracted people. There were violent assaults there on black patrons. It's difficult to tell whether or not that was people coming in from outside, or whether it was white nationalist gay guys. I think that it's not a clear distinctive grouping. So I don't think Rudi wasn't right wing, as far as I can tell. I think, but I think he certainly wasn't, quote unquote, just a guy who liked the fashion. I think he was involved in the music side of the scene as well, and was quite proud of his identity as a skinhead, aside from his identity as a gay skin.
I feel like the skinhead in the gay scene really kind of reached an apex in the 90s. Yeah. And I feel like at that time, if you were to do a Venn diagram, absolutely the overlap was there, but it was a small overlap.
Yeah. The American Nazi Party advertised in Drummer in the 70s.
Yes, fair. Fair.
And it's the worst book I own, right? So I've got a book. That is a history of the
Matt's getting cancelled for his bookshelf.
Well, no, honestly, it's a history of the white power music scene, and it's written by people that were involved with it. And it's sort of pseudo-intellectually presented as this, this is history. But the introduction that is written by the authors basically say...
I absolutely hate these cunts, I'm just going to say it now.
They basically sort of say, we did nothing wrong, Gov. But there is letters. So, and in that they reproduce some old skinhead fanzines, and And in there, it's hilarious. There's letters from white power skins that are like, people keep accusing me of being gay. Oh, these guys, I can't. Like the gay guy, the gay skinheads who are interviewed in various places basically say like, yeah, we can always tell a gay skin. There's a book called Gay Skins, which is worth reading, a little bit of a history of this movement. Although it, as I said, it's paints a bit brighter line than I probably would. But clearly the white power guys were really annoyed because everyone thought they were gay.
Yeah.
Once again, also, take it off your bingo sheet. Me and Matt talk about Nazis on an episode that is completely unrelated to Nazis.
Oh my God.
But I love what's that Sarah Silverman joke. They're cute when they're small, though. Why can't they say small?
Yeah.
But like one thing I want to ask before we finish up, because I've talked to you, Matt, about this. Like, you spend so much time reading like personal correspondences that were intended to be private and intimate between people, and obviously at a time when people were discussing like very like deep secrets and things that, if were known publicly, could cause them harm. How, like, we briefly like read some personal stuff in some archive stuff, and I was incredibly moved by it. How did you feel, Paul, like going through all these letters and seeing like stuff from Rudi and people he connected? And
so I kind of, I guess in my brain, I categorize people into different categories. So there's someone that's more of a public figure like Rudi Inhelder or Fakir Mushafar, that their personal private lives are often blurred. And of course, I'll defer to like the widow, like, is this something that it's okay for me to talk about or not? If there's someone that is surviving that is of concern, then I will, do my best to reach out to them before I share that information. Where I get more sensitive is with people that were obviously living really private lives, such as the Incredible Till, which I have a whole hour-and-a-half presentation just on Till, also known as Tom of Cardiff. And he was for decades, incredibly secretive, had to be. And his correspondence is talking about being married, but also talking about having same-sex relationships. So it's so much harder to navigate that. I guess what I will do is, not guess. What I will do is, like, when I present that stuff is I begin with this. I begin with like, we are dealing with someone's life, and how do we be respectful of this and mindful of the fact that this was someone that was living, breathing, had all these thoughts and ideas, and what an incredible opportunity there is for us to explore this, but we should do it sensitively. But then I also look at, people aren't static. So how did this person change? If we have that luxury, how did this person change over time? And so the Incredible Till, that was only ever known as Till early on, in later years, well, he joins Pauline Clark's Piercing Association of the UK, and he becomes a member there. And she starts using his first name, Tom. And then this guy, Sailor Sid, who we're not talking about yet here, and Jack Yaunt, who we're not talking about yet here, they start corresponding with Tom, and he becomes less and less out of the closet. His wife has passed away, and those are less and less concerns. So I can look at Tom in later years and go, okay, well, it was a different time, it was a different place. He's no longer as closeted. I don't need to be as concerned about keeping his secrets, if you will.
I was gonna say, Matt, we've got to the hour. If you wanna, yeah. I gotta go in like 20 minutes. Like if you want, Matt, I can drop off, and if you and Paul want to keep recording, I will send you the login details. Yeah, 100%. So sorry to put you on a time limit. Work away. But I think that, is a perfect point to wrap up what is probably going to be like part 1 of 2, if not 3 episodes with Paul, as we talk about alternative lifestyles, piercings, and just like pick the brains of probably like the two of the smartest people.
Well, Rudi's life, right? Like Rudi's life in the tattooing and piercing scenes covers 50 years. And it's 50 years of enormous change where he is not quite at the center of it, but he's observing it all and excited by it and thrilled by it right up to the end. And I think like that's probably why we've been recording for over an hour. Probably people have been listening for nearly an hour, and we're not even we're sort of up to the 60s. It's a lot more to say.
But I want to say, like, just not to put too fine a point on it, like not just observing, like he is the conduit. Yeah. He is the connection. He's bringing together so many people and allowing for the transmission of so many ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the book that I'm writing at the moment, which is very short. It's like 35,000 words, and it's meant to be the kind of history of Western tattooing. But it's ended up being a story just because the way I think about the things about the way that Europe, America, and British tattooing are intersected through quite a small number of people. And Rudi's one of those people, certainly in the post-war period. We've listed those names already, but it's amazing how the same names keep coming up, and they're the people who A, love tattooing, B, were kind enough to be nerdy enough to keep stuff, C, although this isn't quite Rudi's case, but C, were loud enough and egotistical enough to talk to newspapers and magazines. Although Rudi did interview by magazines, and who were just able to be happy to be part of this communication, and that number of people is very small, surprisingly small, I think.
Yeah, it surprised me how small it is.
Yeah, but so we should leave it there, Tom. Like in the 60s, where Sailor Jerry and Lyle Tuttle are in the same club.
So, strange bedfellows. But Paul, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. You're honestly, you're welcome back whenever you want, whatever you want to talk about. And if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out Paul's stuff online. The links are all down in the description. If you like this episode and you want to hear more, we have like a really cool back catalog that you can go back through. And you can check us out on Patreon, where you can hear bonus episodes, hear more episodes like this, more episodes early, cool shit to support cool people. And if you subscribe up to the £15 tier, Matt will send you a signed copy of his book directly to your house, sealed with a kiss.
I will plus postal packing if you're not in the UK.
Plus postal packing. But Paul, thank you very much for coming on. Matt, thank you for being my co-host, and it's goodbye from me.
Bye.
Thank you, Tom.